get this out of the way. Guilt is a tyrant, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad or wrong or somehow unneeded. Guilt is, first and foremost, the emotion you experience when you believe that you've compromised a standard of conduct, either your own personal set or a universal one, and that you bear responsibility for that violation. Actually having committed the violation isn't necessary to experience the emotion. All you need is a strongly held belief that you did. And this is what makes guilt tyrannical. Maybe you're just being too hard on yourself. Maybe you're not actually responsible. But it doesn't make the feeling go away. At the same time, this is what also makes guilt necessary. Because if you're not being too hard on yourself and you actually are responsible, then why should the feeling go away? This is, in my opinion, the fundamental problem with the people who believe that fostering self-esteem is a virtue, like teachers and whatever. Because there will be moments in everyone's life where it will be entirely inappropriate to hold yourself in high esteem. And I think if you're watching this video and you're being honest with yourself, you know that this is true, at least sometimes. We're all guilty of something. We've all made mistakes. I've made my share of big ones. You know. Hurt people who didn't deserve it, lost your temper, said the wrong thing, made the wrong choice, missed out on a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity due to negligence or procrastination, felt like you were justified in taking revenge, but it was obviously just an excuse. You know. It's no wonder that classical depictions of guilt often end up looking something like this. Because if you have even the tiniest amount of a spine at all, any willingness to face the results of your actions, you know that guilt is a self-imposed tyranny. And despite that, there are times when it's necessary even more than personal freedoms. But that only works precisely because it's self-imposed. Yes, there are instances where you get caught breaking the law, there's a ton of proof against you, you actually did do it, and you're sent off to jail. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about legal guilt. That's imposed by the justice system, not you. When you're guilty of something, and you know it, and you get away with it, there will always be some small part of you that is inclined to torture yourself. Sometimes it's not worth it. You know, if it was a theft of a chocolate bar 25 years ago when you were a kid, maybe it's not just that you've destroyed your life in torment over it. But sometimes it is worth it. And you can either face that guilt or you can repress it. And when you repress it, you slowly tilt your personality towards greater and greater evil. The floodgates open. The infraction becomes easier to commit. The rationalizations become more sophisticated. Entire buildings can be filled with the stories humans have written about guilt, from books to TV shows to movies. It is one of the primary sources of action in drama. Almost every religion out there is based on the realization of guilt and how we can absolve it. It's something that almost all of us can relate to. It's one of the most powerful emotional forces we're subject to, because it's the realization that we're not living up to our potential. Individual guilt is a self-imposed tyranny. But where does that lead collective guilt? Collective guilt is the idea that a group of people, bound together by some unifying identity, hold collective responsibility for a crime committed by members of that group against another group. A simplified form of this argument is often used in American political discourse, where white people are collectively to blame for the state of black people in that country, due to the multi-generational effects of slavery. And it's not an illegitimate argument. Europeans didn't start the African slave trade, Africans enslaved each other, but European explorers did participate in that slave trade. And the multi-generational effects of slavery are obviously still seen today in some form. But there's still some questions that need asking. If some white people did not participate in the slave trade, are they still guilty? Well, the identitarian left believes that yes, they are, because that's the point of collective guilt. All members of the group are collectively guilty, even if they're not personally guilty, because even if they didn't commit the crime, they lived in a culture that benefited from slavery, and therefore they indirectly benefited from it as well. Because, for example, they purchased cheap goods that were so cheap because of slave labor or whatever. How about this question? When does the collective guilt end? Because presumably, very few white people alive in the West today actually own slaves, and very few black people alive have ever experienced it. David Lammy might talk about experiencing slavery, but let me tell you, he's a UK citizen. The only thing this guy's ever been enslaved to is the buffet table. The identitarian left's answer to the end of collective guilt seems to be whenever things have been equalized. However, we also know that's not really true because women are doing better than men by many metrics right now, and feminists still scream about the patriarchy. It seems to me that collective guilt never ends. And here's the best question of all. If white people are collectively guilty for black slavery, are they also collectively responsible for ending the slave trade? Because that is how it went down. Every culture had a concept of slavery, but European culture was the first to discern the philosophical reasoning for abolition. And again, according to the identitarian left, no, white people don't get bonus points for ending slavery because collective rewards don't exist, only collective guilt. I mean, there's reparations, but technically that's not a collective reward, that's a collective repayment in their framework, but that's another story. So to recap, collective guilt means that all people within a group are guilty of the group's crimes, regardless of their own personal guilt. They live in a society that reaps the benefits of the crime, and so they also reap those benefits. The guilt continues until the harm's been repaid, which is such a subjective measurement that it may as well be eternal. And there is no equivalent collective reward for good deeds. This sounds absolutely ridiculous and flies in the face of personal responsibility and the idea of individual rights, freedoms, and responsibilities enshrined in common law. At the same time, I'm not making the argument that collective guilt is always illegitimate. Sometimes it actually makes sense under specific extreme circumstances. In The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky puts forward what I think is a reasonable description of collective guilt. There is only one way to salvation, and that is to make yourself responsible for all men's sins. As soon as you make yourself responsible in all sincerity for everything and for everyone, you will see at once that this is really so. And you are in fact to blame for everyone and for all things. Now, on the face of it, that actually sounds quite unreasonable, but is it really? I mean, how many times have you felt the tyranny of self-imposed guilt, and you've deserved it? Be honest with yourself. Every time you've made a mistake, it's a real mistake. If you're part of the world and you do something evil, that's not just you becoming a little bit more evil, that's the whole world becoming a little bit more evil by virtue of you being a part of it. It's the same thing with doing good, too. This is why the viral meme of everyone's favorite frogman, Jordan Peterson, clean your room, actually holds weight. If your room is a part of the world, then cleaning it is also cleaning part of the world as well. But it's also practice for cleaning up larger, more important parts of the world, which is why it's always so funny to listen to these sheltered university-indoctrinated hipsters talk about implementing a worldwide revolution towards a communist utopia when they can't even handle getting out of bed before 9 a.m. But if everything you do matters, if every action you take ripples outward and affects everyone around you, if every time you do something evil, that's the whole world collectively getting a little bit more evil, then how is Dostoevsky wrong? How are you not, in some small way, responsible for the absolute disaster zone of the entire planet? How is that not collective guilt? Let's talk about the most obvious extreme example of being responsible for everything. Nazi Germany. If we imagine ourselves as living through that hell, we all like to think of ourselves as part of the resistance against tyranny, one of the heroes. Maybe some of us would be. But let's be honest, most of us would probably be collaborators. I mean, how many times did you fail to stand up to that bully in school? How many times were you afraid to step out from under the shadow of your parents and tell them that no, they can't tell you what to do anymore? How many times should you have spoken up at a meeting, or to your boss, but you didn't? How many times has a romantic partner taken advantage of you in some way? Don't tell me you'd be a hero of the resistance. I probably wouldn't be. We'd probably be too scared and too horrified to look at our own guilt. But that's where the guilt comes from, isn't it? Not standing up when you should? If you and I were in Nazi Germany, how much of it would be our fault? How much would we let ourselves get swept up by the indoctrination, told ourselves we believed it, maybe forced ourselves to actually believe it? What opportunities would we have ignored to maybe calm down the rhetoric a little bit? Convince a friend of a different path? Refuse to collaborate when things went too far? How many times would we be guilty? And how many times does it have to be until everyone is guilty? I do think the Germans of that era hold a collective responsibility for the horrors of Nazism. But the time for that has passed, hasn't it? Germany's changed. The people are all new. Reparations have been paid. Isn't enough enough? Collective guilt is a tricky topic, and it's not to be thrown around lightly. It's clearly legitimate in extreme circumstances, but who judges what's extreme enough? When has the accused been sufficiently punished for that crime? And what do you do when you're personally innocent, but somebody else demands that you be guilty and feel guilty based on their sense of collective guilt? I'm sorry this video has been quite rambly thus far. I haven't put up many articles or sources because this has largely been my own thoughts on the matter. But I think establishing what guilt is important if we're going to discuss the difference between the tyranny of self-imposed guilt and the tyranny of guilt imposed onto you. The identitarian left understands the tyranny of guilt. They understand that when they are truly guilty, when they feel it, when they know it in their soul, people don't need to be tyrannized. They'll just do it to themselves. It's no surprise to me that they want their political opponents in a state of self-paralysis. That's what white guilt is, for example. White people hamstringing themselves out of a sense of fair play. A good male feminist holds himself back so that women may march over top of him. Gay pride is necessary while straight pride is offensive. On the political side of all of these discussions, the motivation always stems from the desire to induce collective guilt. It's a power play, and it's a power play that wouldn't work in a truly equal society. 20 years ago, the left was all about liberalism, legal equal rights, freedom of opportunity, being colorblind. But if you're colorblind, if we're all just people, then there's no groups to racialize. There's no way to have an oppressor class and a victim class. There's no way for collective guilt to take hold. So when the left shifted away from liberalism and towards identitarianism, they had to embrace the same old racism they once fought against, because it provided a quick and dirty way for them to gain power over their opponents. And if you don't take on this collective guilt, if you don't publicly self-flagellate, you can expect the establishment to punish you, like the math teacher who lost her job for defending Western civilization. The teacher stated that each of us here believes in the unparalleled force for good that is Western civilization. That is our heritage, whether we were born here or not. And shortly thereafter, she was told her teaching contract would not be renewed because of her outside activities. Or like this dude, wearing a Union Jack suit, being told that his outfit is offensive.
They won't let him in the pub because he's dressed like that.
It's disgusting.
This is the state of our country.
You have a policy of no, they won't let me in. I would all drink my beers and come out and go to a different pub. They won't let me in.
Absolute joke.
And if you,
Won't let him in because he's got a union flagged suit on.
and if you complain, you're kicking off.
Yeah, and if you complain, you're kicking off. So none of us can go in now.
If you can't display the flag of your own country in that country, then what else is there? Immigrants display their own flags all the time. Other countries don't have an aversion to national pride, regardless of any collective guilt that they have or should be taking on. Why is it only in Western countries where recognizing that your heritage isn't all evil, that it actually has some good to it, is offensive? Well, it's offensive because the people that do this, you and I, we don't hold to their notion of collective guilt. We refuse to paralyze ourselves and let them take over. So their only choice left is to fight us directly. To the identitarian left, there is no distinction between the liberals, the centrists, and the right. They only see two groups. The people who show sufficient guilt for their original sin, the good allies, or the people who don't, the alt-right Nazis. And what qualifies as sufficient guilt seems to depend entirely on how much of a useful idiot you are to their cause. Countless public figures have been Me Too'd out of existence with no proof, no matter how hard they apologize, reaffirm themselves to the feminist cause, donate to charities, whatever. But somebody like Justin Trudeau, despite wearing blackface like a dozen times when he was 29 or whatever, he's largely been forgiven because he's a feminist prime minister. It's all power politics. And yeah, as for Trudeau, Canada's elections are coming up in a few weeks. I'll have a lot more to say about him soon. This double standard was particularly on display last month, where two shootings happened simultaneously. The El Paso shooter published an anti-Latino manifesto before proceeding to target Latinos at a local Walmart, around the same time that the Dayton shooter, who described himself as a metalhead leftist, shot up Ned Pepper's, a local bar. Can you guess which shooting received the majority of media attention? Can you guess which shooting the media just didn't know the motive for? In this article, both shootings are talked about, but the majority of the article focuses on the El Paso shooter and Trump's tweets surrounding the situation, with only a small bit at the end talking about the Dayton shooter, presumably only because Trump mentioned both in his tweet. And the headline still only talks about one of the two shootings, with Trump blaming immigration for the racist mass shooting that killed 22. It's clear that collective guilt only applies to one group in these people's minds. To them, the Dayton shooter was a lone wolf who we may never know the motive for, while the El Paso shooter was a product of the white capitalist patriarchy, and Trump is complicit as a white man himself and should have used his platform to push their agenda if he actually cared about the issue. Of course, reality paints a different picture. Here's the mass shooters of 2019 so far, and holy shit, is that Tonkasaw? Okay, anyway, are you noticing a pattern? I'm seeing a lot of men and only a few women. I'm seeing a good number of black people with a sizable minority of white people and a few from other races. Why should the collective guilt fall onto white people and only white people? There's a far greater argument for it to fall onto men of all races, but no, the media pushes white people, because white people are expected to have collective guilt, and it's a crime when they don't. Viral articles like "Straight Black Men Are the White People of Black People," or the current civil war between the trans exclusionary radical feminists and the trans rights activists show the state of the identitarian left today. The identitarians have crafted a group identity that has no internal cohesion. It only exists as a reaction. It's defined by not being a part of another group. And as the cracks in the foundation grow and the fights between subfactions break out, the only ideological framework they have to attack each other with is saying that they're like white people or part of the patriarchy or whatever. They're now expected to take on a form of collective guilt when all of their activism up to this point has revolved around forcing that guilt onto whoever they saw as oppressors. I've been talking about collective guilt for a while now, and I haven't even reached the fatal flaw in their argument. Personal guilt or innocence, in all circumstances, overrides collective guilt. When you are truly collectively guilty, you are also personally guilty. And when you're personally innocent, somebody insisting that you take on collective guilt knows the tyranny of guilt and wants to place you in their chains. To them, your personal innocence is an obstacle to overcome. We've reached a point where collective guilt is not just important, but more important than personal guilt. So much so that personal guilt disappears from their framework altogether. So much so that we must become unfit to even recognize the guilt of others in their eyes. A white person is no longer allowed to notice when a black person is guilty, because the original sin of whiteness will always overshadow any action a black person takes. A man cannot complain about being falsely accused of rape, or even being raped himself, because the victimhood of women must not be challenged. And even if he is innocent, it's his duty to use that as an opportunity to help real victims of rape, not for him to declare his innocence. That is the true tyranny of guilt. To be so guilty that you're no longer fit to recognize the guilt of others. To accept your exploitation by other guilty parties. To take whatever punishment cancel culture deems necessary for the rest of your life. And not only to submit to this, but to feel it in your soul. To become a link in your own chain. I'm not saying don't accept guilt. Obviously, there's many instances where not only do you have to, but it's better for you if you do. But don't let anyone else push it off on you. If you're honest with yourself, you know when you're guilty. You don't need somebody else with a political agenda swooping in and telling you what to feel. If they're actually right, you know it yourself already. And if they're wrong, then they've revealed themselves to be the tyrant that they are.
There is a weird self-loathing going on among white liberals, and it's not helping anyone. Lifting up those whose society has cheated or forsaken, that's liberalism. Hating all things white is just tedious virtue signaling. It puts the burden on black people to absolve you. It's really asking black people to, again, do something for you. Forgive me. Absolve me. Recognize that I'm one of the good white people. Jesus. Haven't black people suffered enough slavery, Jim Crow, and now I got to make some yuppie feel better about himself?